Welcome to this edition of the Hindu on Books podcast, and we are very honored to have someone as distinguished as Professor T.V. Paul to discuss his new book, which is titled The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi. Professor Paul is the author or the editor of 22 books, and this is the 23rd, or
this was 20, two more are coming.
two more are coming, all right. And not surprisingly, he is distinguished James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University, Montreal, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Welcome, Professor Paul, to the Hindu's Books podcast.
Thank you for having me. I sometimes read or watch the podcast or listen to it. So.
Thank you. Okay, so let us start our discussion today by asking you a very basic question about why this title, The Unfinished Quest. Why is it unfinished?
The quest has been going on for the last 75 plus years. In fact, even before independence.
The quest for world status,
for a world
superpower status? Or?
I wouldn't call it superpower, a major leading power status. Mm-hmm. Superpower would require a global power projection capability. But first you get to be a major power or major actor in world politics. Mm-hmm. So the quest was tarnished partly because the colonial period, India suffered just like all other colonies. More so because it lasted some 200 years. And then when independence came, it was 2 years short of, after 2 years, the UN was set up. So it missed the boat in the Security Council membership, permanent membership. So ever since then, India has been struggling to gain a foothold in the hierarchy of nations. And first, Nehru tried to use soft power, civilizational power, diplomacy, considerable amount of mediation role, etc., and had some success as the most important emerging state, decolonized state. It was actually playing a role in Korean War and Vietnam War, a series of peacekeeping operations. But all those lacked the sufficient hard power, that is economic power and military power. And when in 1962 India was exposed, when the Chinese defeated India, that sort of tarnished that opportunity to some extent. But the quest never went away. And Indira Gandhi tested the nuclear weapon, although Shastri was proud to do it, but didn't do it. And then, of course, she didn't develop a deterrent, but it was the BJP's turn under Atal Bihari Vajpayee to test it, although the weapon was developed during Rajiv Gandhi's time. So all the parties in India have this ambition to be playing a leading role. Where the big turning point was, the aspiration became more realistic after the 1991 liberalization, when the economy started to pick up. And that really gave the Indian elite the confidence that it could become second, third largest economy in another 2 decades. And the world is slowly recognizing it. But the institutionalization or legitimation of this position is yet to happen, because the established powers don't have the room for a new state yet. Mm-hmm. And China is the #1 state that is now challenging that quest. But the quest has increased, especially under Mr. Modi, for reasons of nationalism and using the Hindutva ideology as a way to mobilize the efforts. And there are some success in the swing power role that India is playing today.
So in your title, your subtitle of the book is suggesting a kind of continuity from Nehru to Modi in that quest. But the dominant narrative in India, not merely endorsed but projected by the government of India, is that, or at least there is an understatement of that continuity to emphasize the fact that India's pursuit for a global status is actually began in its full earnest only right now. So how would you characterize India's pursuit for global status in the Nehruvian era to the current times?
Actually, it is unfortunately a wrong impression, of course, for electoral politics reasons. It makes sense for whoever is advancing that. Without Nehru's initial success in creating that strategic autonomy through non-alignment, India would have partly become an ally of either the West or the Soviet Union, which did become later kind of an ally. But that wouldn't have given it this understanding of a unique country. In many ways, it has to have the voice that it deserved. And Indira Gandhi tried her best, but material power was weak. But the victory over Pakistan in 1971 gave a short-term fillip to that. The nuclear test was another issue. But without the liberalization and the economic reforms and the achievements of the previous Congress regime under Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, none of it is possible today, what we are seeing. And more importantly, the 2005 nuclear accord, which Manmohan Singh and President George Bush signed, that removed India from what you call the nuclear apartheid regime. In fact, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh told me personally that in a meeting I had, this was the #1 goal. So India's arrival has been going on, and of course this current ruling elite have more ambition for various reasons, and some success, I would say, in playing the swing power role. But much of that, for instance, look east, many of these policies that we hear today are actually originated through Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh's period.
So what is now being called as being a swing action or being the status of a swing power, is it any different from what we used to call strategic autonomy?
The difference is that today you have an emerging Cold War situation. China and the US were not that hostile when Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao were doing the thing. So there was a lot more opportunity in befriending China too. And Russia was not this aggressive. For status reasons, it's fighting the Ukraine war. So the swing power status increased, especially with the Quad, which, by the way, happened during Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's time, and the rapprochement with Japan and Southeast Asia, etc. So the opportunity here today is that India's material power has increased. Its economy now is overtaken, I believe, Germany and Japan very soon. And so this is a moment that is happening because of the economic achievements and the fact that the US is finding China threatening, or US is threatening China with economic sanctions and hoping that India would play a role of swing power, but that concept itself has problems. I can tell you that straight away.
So you argue in the book, if I get it correctly, that this maintaining a strategic ambiguity and trying to be on various multi-alignment, as the current strategists call it, it is going to be extremely difficult when there is an increasing polarization.
Depolarization
is happening.
Yes.
So you think there is no escape from that polarization? You are actually foreseeing the world divided into two camps from here on?
I think the polarization will be slightly different because the United States, despite what Mr. Trump is proclaiming, cannot easily escape the Chinese supply chain role. If you cut off everything, your economy will have major consequences. Your supply to Walmart, to Costco, to whatnot. So there will be some efforts to control the high-tech areas, chip as well as AI, etc. But I have a feeling that China has so smartly embedded itself in the global economic order. You cannot just escape from that unless there is a real rupture. And so I think the conflict will be strategically, militarily, it can increase if the naval competition becomes wider. But the Chinese have cleverly decided not to put too many naval bases across wherever they are, even Indian Ocean. They have access to Sri Lankan ports or Myanmar or all these countries, but only 1 or 2 ports they have that can be called naval bases. But they are building aircraft carriers slowly. Ships they are building much wider. So there is a potential for a conflict in Taiwan, for instance. But I think the Chinese are quite pragmatic in this game of playing the game.
No, but the event of clear polarization and the risk or the possibility of a military conflict between China and the United States, would India be able to maintain
very difficult
autonomy?
You cannot then call a Quad member. The Quad is not a military alliance, but the underlying idea is that it will activate into some form of an alliance if the Chinese become threatening to Japanese security, to Southeast Asian security. So India will have to play neutrality to some extent to avoid the Chinese escalation on the northern and our China border. But it may have to provide some supplies, some kind of secondary ancillary role to remain as some kind of a supporter to or the established idea of maintaining international order. That will be the test time for India, how to maintain.
We will come back to that point a few questions later. I want to go back to the original thesis about the quest for status and what factors determine it. So one part of the reasons of status is that what you objectively have, and the other is what others are willing to concede.
Yes.
So in the first part, for what is objective national power, maybe you have economic factors, you have military factors, and you have cultural factors.
Soft power.
Soft power. So how do you classify? What is actually the most significant part of that objective aspects of a country's power?
In olden times, in the European era, it was military power.
Right.
Because conquest was what determined defeating your other peer powers was the way to achieve great power. Today it is economic power, definitely, which helps military power. Military power is still important. So economic power, in the sense, it is not just the GDP alone, it is an important factor, but how good the economy is, what is the per capita income, what is sort of the quality of life of the people, what kind of benefits the average person gets from the economic growth, and that is the economy a consequence to the world economy. Okay, your stock market, your decisions you make, how does it affect others? There, India is yet to get there. Even though the GDP is big, but it is very much a domestic driven economy. And if you look at, of course, there is trade increasing, but it is still not the trading power that China is or United States is. So the Bombay Sensex often appears in all the Asian stock forecasts as the last one, which shouldn't be the case. You know, it should come at least third along with this economic power. So become a consequential economic power is very important. And it could become partly because India hasn't opened up enough in trade, investment, and it hasn't made use of this opportunity that US-China rivalry is offering sufficiently as, say, Vietnam or other Southeast Asian countries.
And in that combination, how significant is culture or soft power, and where does India stand on that count?
Well, it had many elements, or has many elements. It is a mega civilization and great recognition that contributed immensely to human advancement. Latest books by Dalrymple talks about a lot of the Indosphere. But the question is, historical achievements alone is not enough. What is the consequence of that historical achievement to today's world order problems? Can we solve world order problems using the civilizational approach? There may be a disjunction in terms of how much you can use religious ideas, for instance, and whether the areas where Indian civilization spread, how do they look at India? Do they respect India yet? So the respect would be what you call power of attraction. That's a soft power. Needs more work. It is not based on coercion or forcing someone to love you, you know. It's that.
Right. So that is so in international affairs, how is status commanded, or is it demanded or commanded? Who are we are seeking, but who are the givers?
The givers are, in the first place, the peer group, the great powers themselves. Second, increasingly regional states, your immediate neighborhood, and the what you call the near abroad. In India's case, Southeast Asia, the Gulf. So that recognition also is now in this era of popular social media and only social. People have to like you too. So India's standing is not bad. It is in Pew and other surveys. Perceptions have improved quite a bit.
Favorability for India is like very high in Canada.
I wouldn't call high, given the latest issue with the Canada-India in Canada, that's going down. But I think the US and other East Asian countries, it's improved quite a bit. Partly because It is not a threatening power yet to anyone. It could play a role of a stabilizer if there is a conflict. But the Indian diplomacy is also facing challenges from China in a big way. If you look at BRI, but if the BRI fails, then India has a little bit more opportunity, but it need not fail. It may still continue in different fashion. Some places it could still succeed, some places it could fail. India has not come up with a anything counter to BRI. BRI is the Belt and Road Initiative.
So if it were the existing powers that were to grant a great power status to an emerging claimant of that one, so which countries would you count that? The P5?
Number one is United States.
Number one is United States.
So for that reason, India has the 4 great powers in its support to its position.
Who are?
United States, UK, France, and Russia.
Right.
But China is the remaining powerful opponent, and some regional states, because the UN has got still more democratic control over this matter. The General Assembly has to approve. The problem is the General Assembly is driven by sovereignty norms or ideas of equality. They are not interested in a new hierarchy unless they are forced to. So where things could change is an international crisis like the 2008-2009, when the BRICS emerged to solve that crisis. They played a big role. So my sense is the UN may not be the best forum for India. It would be G20 or something similar. And the G20, India is playing a role along with Indonesia. This recent past 3 summits succeeded because of the efforts by India, Indonesia, and now Brazil.
So among the P5, 4 are very clearly, more or less,
they would support,
favorably disposed to it.
Yes.
China, India relationship has a lot of challenges.
Yeah.
Now, in the absence of a much more, or let me frame it differently, what are the challenges that India face in the close neighborhood, including China, in its aspiration for a
So the
great
Chinese
power
relationship is one of rivalry but occasional friendship. China likes to keep India in that position because its goals, some of its goals, especially for global governance, reforms of global governance, India is needed on collective action issues, climate or trade and issues like, and its fight with the West, with the United States at this point. So actually, even though China is opposed to India as a member with permanent veto power, China might, if you make a tactical deal with them, agree for membership just without the veto power, which India doesn't want, but I think veto power is probably going to be very hard. There would be several other players, including Brazil, maybe an African country or African Union itself. So there has to be an effort to deal with China on that, but China may expect some quid pro quo, which would mean helping China in some trade deals or something. China is pragmatic. China is opposed to make an equivalent power, but to give India a role in these global issues. And China also realizes that sometimes India would support Chinese position on issues. So a rapprochement can happen. I'm not ruling it out completely.
So on the question of China, what's very interesting to note is in the last 30, 40 years maybe, the United States, Canada, India, all have had periods of friction and periods of camaraderie, bonhomie with China. US strategy itself has actually fluctuated from seeing China as a potential partner on all these issues that mentioned, particularly climate change, disarmament, etc., but also then suddenly flipping to describing China as adversary, potential threat, etc. So what is your, how do you see that emerge, that situation emerging? Do you actually think it is going towards an irreconcilable divergence and conflict, or do you think there will be some kind of agreement between the US and China we are talking about right now?
Yes. I think Xi Jinping's arrival made the biggest difference. China was on a peaceful rise trajectory under Deng and the 2 successors. Xi Jinping became too ambitious and then started making proclamations by 2049, we will be the leading power. And the Americans started looking at it as, replacing us as the hegemonic power. And the second, Xi Jinping massively increased naval buildup, which is the primary marker of American hegemony in the Pacific. So all these areas where the Chinese made a big mistake and then they closed the shop, they are not easy to access anymore. Like people like us used to go there to the universities, and there was freedom, reasonable freedom China. This Xi Jinping's regime has brought back the communist sort of controls. Big mistake, because Chinese were starting to be accepted as basically a G2, even by America. And so they could have somehow worked out that relationship, even though it would have conflictual elements to it, partly because they need the American market. They cannot yet abandon it. And she thought that this BRI and trade with all these global South countries could help that. The global South countries, most of them don't have that kind of money to pay to
things,
them. Yeah. And so many of them are heavily indebted. So Xi Jinping might make some tactical adjustments if he wants to survive this competition, because if Trump imposes a lot of those sanctions and tariffs, Chinese economy could go down. Already is going down. But I wouldn't write off China in any manner. In fact, it has the future.
So do you think, so India has a quest for great power status, starting from the assumption that it has to be accepted as one by existing big players. So would that be possible in the emerging scenario, or how do you see that situation playing out in the emerging scenario of increasing polarization? And will India be able to maintain that? Going back to the earlier question, so can India be a friend of Russia and China and US at the same time as we currently assume that we are?
So the reason why India is a friend of both is to avoid depolarization. This is not sold out well, telling rest of the world very well. This is part of the problem with Indian diplomacy. India is doing a public good by not polarizing the system. Non-aligned countries tried to do that, didn't succeed. They didn't have the material capacity. So a world in polarized form is not in the interest of most of the global South countries. You look at every global South country, which one has really condemned Russia? And all of them are for sovereignty, independence, etc. So they are really upset with Russia, but they are also aware that Russia is an essential player to keep the system not becoming bipolar or unipolar. So there is a strategic interest in keeping Russia. Unfortunately, Mr. Putin's playing hard is good old European rough military power. And that has really affected. So Indian actions are really helping at least to slow down the polarization. If India also joins the West, and then China and Russia will form a coalition. So India wants to avoid that coalition, okay, which is in the interest of the West. This is something India has to tell the West more clearly. Look, we don't want you to face this joint operation. And so there's a balance of power calculation there. So India's diplomacy has a lot of depth in it, but it's sometimes come out as, yeah, China gives us oil, they are friends with us, and they've been good with us for a long time, therefore we need them. That's not enough, you know. There is a real grand strategy purpose of keeping Russia alive.
Well, so people who are not really appreciative of that that position of India as a common good, and quite often interpret it as ambiguity and lack of moral courage, etc., or strategic clarity, so to speak, would argue that India's rising power status can only be reinforced when it actually takes strong positions on issues like Ukraine or many other issues. So you obviously are not actually opposing that view.
I'm not opposing that. In fact, India needs clarity on many issues, collective action problems such as climate change or even trade. India often acts as a veto player, which is, its support is needed for any agreement to pass through. Even recent plastic agreement, there was India was playing this veto role. Veto role is good, very short term, but it doesn't solve any problems. Of course, slowing down the climate change negotiations or any of those negotiations may help short-term tactical benefits. And there is some satisfaction that we are still counted. That's not enough. What's the alternative to the climate situation we are in? And look at this city. I mean, doesn't it need a better climate environment? So what are the alternatives India proposes? Is it simply to slow down things? And there is a lot of nationalism and sovereignty idea in this old idea of we don't really need to do much collectively. India really needs to think about solutions to the problem. You talked about Nehru. I mean, Nehru had some solutions to the world problems. He was the first one to recommend a test ban treaty. And the Western countries paid attention to that noise. The limited test ban treaty had an imprint of Nehru or Nehruvian proposal. So there are things that India could do instead of, sometimes it gives the impression that it's only interested in its own interest, which is a kind of a classical realism in international relations, which is not enough. You have to say that your interests are the interests of the world.
Right. Professor Paul, international affairs is an area where predictions easily go wrong.
Absolutely.
But still, I will push you to make a prediction today, which is the question is, do you see the risk of India being pushed or cornered into taking a clear-cut position in favor or against China or between China and the US in the coming decade or so? And if it lands up in that situation, where do you think India will align?
The ball is on China's court. If China escalates this rivalry or needling, as Xi Jinping has been doing on the border, simultaneously there is a massive conflict with Taiwan, and all of the West and the United States and Japan all get involved. India will have to take a position. And that position would mean, even if it's not direct participation, but supportership, second, as I mentioned, supporting the US operations in some fashion. So neutrality is not going to be easy. In fact, many countries thought they will be neutral in World War II. They got sucked into it because you are in the pivotal area called Indo-Pacific. So if you want to be a player in that situation, you have to play a role. But I would also urge that India has to play diplomacy to avoid escalation into such conflicts. Cannot just stand off or keep away from this. This affects you, affects the little countries. Whenever great powers fought, who are the victims? It's the one in between. Look at all of Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia or European conquest. So this conquest is not in anybody's interest. So there has to be engagement. There has to be a lot more understanding of the unnecessary need for this conflict. For status, they think somehow they can dominate the world like that. And then a position that the G20 idea is a bad one, but in order to do that, in order to be a G3, your economy has to be very important. Your living standards have to improve, not the global south conditions you see in many parts of India. So that means a developmental state using the demographic dividend and massively increasing the quality of life and the economic growth itself. Everybody needs India. That's sort of a situation it has to happen.
Right. Thank you, Professor Paul, for joining us for
Wonderful
this discussion
to be with you.
on your book, The Unfinished Quest.
Yes.
Thank you.